This episode is sponsored by Rago.
George Nakashima was a trained architect, a designer, a thinker, but he called himself woodworker. For nearly 5 decades, he lived in New Hall, Pennsylvania, crafting some of the most memorable and poetic pieces of furniture in the history of American design. Most people consider him the hero of the studio movement, and his pieces were the first studio furniture to be collected in the secondary marketplace. He integrated work, life, and the natural world which he admired when crafting furniture that grew out of his philosophy and belief that every tree deserves another chance, a second life, in his words.
My father did believe that trees have lives. Some of them live better lives than others, and the ones who have lived a good life deserve a chance to have a second life through becoming furniture.
He was religious, he was artistic, he was just a great human being.
He listened to his clients. It's not as though they would come and be told what they wanted. He really integrated their needs and desires.
For me, there's a certain spirituality in every work that I've ever handled by Nakashima, from his most Baroque to his most austere.
I remember doing the flea markets in Lambertville back in the 70s, and even back then, in the early 70s, George Nakashima was iconic. Oh, that table looks like a Nakashima, people would say, and I really didn't know what they meant. I was 17 years old, but it stayed with me that this was important material.
Nakashima Furniture is practically unique in the catalog of the decorative arts.
George Nakashima's furniture affords me the opportunity to mix a warmth and an organic element.
The choice of woods, the choice of the base, the configuration of the piece, the placement of the butterflies, the use of sapwood, the myriad details that he can attend to, is done brilliantly.
In the early 2000s, a decade after his death, Nakashima had suddenly come into the international spotlight, and his furniture has since become regular in the marketplace. It all began with one coffee table that was offered for sale by the design department at Philips, New York, at the time headed by James Zemaitis.
I had just started at Philips. This was the spring of 2001. It was my first time where I could curate my own catalog. In the middle of putting together the sale, I received a phone call from a woman outside of Princeton who was the personification of the typical Nakashima owner. Her and her husband had acquired 2 or 3 pieces. She was moving, she was downsizing from her big house to some sort of smaller townhouse, and she had this gorgeous Nakashima coffee table that she wanted to sell. And to be quite frank, I had never considered Nakashima for auction because it was continually being sold outside of New York. So I went to look at the table, I was blown away, and I realized by looking at the base, it was a conoid base, I believe, that there was a modernism implicit in the form. It just had this individual majesty, and it was when I really suddenly, really head over the heels, fell in love with Nakashima.
His name and his work have gradually become known among collectors, and his best, most unique pieces have come to fetch 6 figures in the secondary market. Nakashima's furniture is now appreciated and sought after by curators, scholars, and collectors, recognizing his place in the pantheon of American design. It is sold in auction houses, art fairs, and high-end galleries led by Modern Gallery in Philadelphia, founded by Robert Aibel.
By 1985, I had my first opportunity to buy the work of George Nakashima. And I never really thought about buying the work of George Nakashima. It hadn't been something that was on my radar. I was dealing in French Art Deco. But the beauty of the work and the incredible expressiveness of the work was something that I found so appealing that even though at the time people called it used furniture, I saw it as having a great deal more potential than that.
Your father had hundreds of fans from all over the country who used to come here to New Hope, and they used to choose wood here in this storage to buy furniture from him. But it wasn't until about 10 years after he died that his name had become internationally known. What do you think he would say if he was living today, witnessing this amazing love and admiration?
I could see him smiling and thinking that at last people understand what he was trying to do during his lifetime. And it's unfortunate, but a lot of great artists were not recognized until after they were gone. And in the beginning, I thought, well, Dad would either laugh or he would cry. I don't know.
And what do you think he would say if he saw the prices that his furniture fetch today?
He came from the same philosophy as Soetsu Yanagi, the Mingei philosophy, which was that even things made by hand should be made with honesty, they should be made to be used, and they should be accessible to all people. Now it's only accessible to very rich people, and I don't know whether he would think that was a good thing or not.
He summarized his philosophy in the autobiography, The Soul of the Tree. The tree, he wrote, is perhaps our most intimate contact with nature. Nakashima glorified the wood and its natural state and became fascinated with rare roots, exotic species, and ancient trees. In his hands, the dead came alive in the form of a table, a chest, or a chair, while the tree was giving another life. I really wonder, when you spoke to him, how did he convey this passion? How did he convey this idea, his philosophy?
He didn't do it with words. Either he assumed I had read the numerous interviews about him, or that with time, by going through the archives, I would discover this. First and foremost, one has to remember, he determined everything. The shape of the spindles, the height of the chair seat, the height of the back, the length of the table, the proportions. So it was first George's words, determination, then secondarily, the wood was allowed to speak.
As an interior designer, you buy a lot of pieces of George Nakashima furniture for your clients. Tell me about the process, first of all, of you selecting and also of conveying to the clients that this is a great piece.
You break the evaluation of the furniture probably into two categories. There's the ineffable, and then there's the quantifiable. So in terms of the quantifiable, which is probably the easiest to deal with, you're aware of provenance and date of manufacture and the rarity of the wood and the rarity of the form. But then there are the ineffable qualities, and those are the ones that are much more difficult to define. There are those qualities in Nakashima that are very, very difficult to pin down.
Do you have any advice for new collectors how to develop that?
It is truly experience, and it's looking, and it's looking and looking again. It's this relentless search. And I think especially important with Nakashima, because so much of the appeal of Nakashima's work is in its intellectual credentials.
Furniture, he believed, should be lived in and not be treated as overly precious. The more surface is used, he said, the more resistant and beautiful it becomes. And indeed, his furniture ages so well that the more you live with it, the more beautiful it becomes. You've lived with George Nakashima's furniture for over 60 years.
Right.
How is it?
It brings me peace. I love it. I just look at it and I'm soothed by it. And as a result, as you can see, it's not very much, I don't have a whole lot of things around, because that was his theory. You know, his things were simple. I've never had any of it refinished. I rub it with 4-0 steel wool and then use lemon oil on it and rub it in real good and let it dry, and that comes right back.
Well, what type of personality do you think one has to have to love it?
They'd have to love wood, because that's what it's all about. And And they would have to like the simplicity of it and the fact that you lived with the errors in the wood, you know, the things that rotted. That's part of the design. And that's what's so beautiful about it.
Collectors today, when they come to buy Nakashima, let's say a coffee table, they really love the patina, right? They love to see that the surface has been used, but it wasn't this way always, right?
I think the taste changed at the same time that modern design collectors were collecting work by Jean Prouvé, by Charlotte Perriand, and they were finding work that in many cases had been used in dormitories, overseas, in remote colonial outposts, and the work was battered and beaten up. And Nakashima's furniture, which was battered up more by folks in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, there was this immediate appreciation of the age that had just happened in a thoroughly natural way.
His furniture was made to live with, and I remember him saying that there is nothing is quite as uninteresting as a completely polished, perfect surface. We try to get it polished and perfect before it leaves here, but once it's in somebody's home, you're supposed to live with it. People would come in and say, well, there's a little spot on my table there, and can you refinish it? And Dad would say, why? Use it, you know, and then by the time they use it, there's spots all over it, and that's part of the patina, that's part of your history.
Well, it really depends on the piece, doesn't it? You know, a lot of the Nakashima furniture was lived with hard, and a lot of it was cleaned incorrectly. So in those cases, the piece might become lifeless.
When Nakashima came into my life, I was in my early 20s, a young college graduate. I visited him here and I fell in love. I fell in love with the man and with the furniture, and I started buying them piece by piece. Traveling to New Hope was always an inspiring, thoughtful, and sort of meditative experience. It was a long time before I decided to become a design historian, and sometimes I think that perhaps this experience, meeting Nakashima, looking at his lifestyle, at the furniture that he made, at the way he was living here in New Hope, perhaps this experience planted the seeds for my passion for design. George Nakashima became a part of our lives, almost like a member of the family, and his furniture was everywhere. We have lived with this furniture ever since. We raised a family, we had endless dinners, and we crafted our lives living with his crafted pieces. You really don't have to be a collector or a curator or a design scholar to understand and love this furniture, because there is something very humble about it, yet sophisticated and witty. And once you begin living with it, it's very hard to part from it. When my son got married last year, he asked for a piece of furniture by George Nakashima as a wedding gift. And I immediately went to Bob Aibel.
Sometimes people will actually buy Nakashima pieces of furniture for a family member because it's something that they know the family member will have pretty much forever. And it may even stay in the family for generations. So it's a kind of a wonderful opportunity for somebody to give something that not only is meaningful at the moment, but potentially has a history in the family.
My daughter had two friends that she was quite friendly with. They lived close. They all lived sort of right near each other. And whenever they came over, they loved the furniture. And their parents had traditional furniture. They'd never seen anything like this before. And so it must have stuck in their memory, because when they grew up, they both bought Nakashima furniture.
How this furniture defines your taste, or whether your taste became defined by the furniture?
It defined me to lessen and lessen things. So I got rid of more and more things. And when we moved here, I had an antique dealer come and she took so much stuff away. And I'm so happy, because I don't need all that anymore.
What did you learn from George Nakashima?
Elegance is simplicity. That's what I learned.
So many types of collectors love to live with Nakashima's furniture, and it is used today by architects crafting some of the most stylish homes in the world.
I've got clients that live with French Art Deco and mix it with George Nakashima. I've got clients that have American antiques that mix it with Nakashima.
There are collectors for George Nakashima's work from literally almost every country in the world and almost every state in the United States. That is, his interest for his work started in the United States and primarily on the East Coast, but over the last 10 to 20 years, the interest has grown so dramatically, so there's no longer any geographical limit to his work. Nakashima's work appeals to people in all different environments as well. That is, people from the city, people from the country, people in any location. It really doesn't matter also what kind of home they have, because it works in mid-century homes, it works in contemporary homes, it works in traditional American homes, it works in Asian-inspired, influenced homes.
I got into a collection not long ago. It was out in the Midwest, a really good collection. And I walked in and I looked at the pieces, and it had belonged to the woman's grandmother. And I said, okay, so this isn't normal. Your grandmother could not have been normal. So let me get this straight. She was wealthy, she was educated, she had taste, she had money, and she was a friend of George's. Is that right? And she says, bingo, they're all right. So the people that bought Nakashima, especially back in the day, tended to be intelligent, moneyed, educated, well-traveled. And they usually had some sort of connection with George. I think what's really interesting about the Nakashima market is that it's moved to Europe in many instances. I'd say a good third of what I'm selling is going to clients in Europe, and it's not one city. It's Paris, it's London, it's Milan, and Brussels. A number of European buyers are buying Nakashima.
The very first collector that I remember was my godmother, and she wanted to furnish her Bethlehem Steel executive house in something a little softer, a little more interesting, a little more artistic, and then ended up buying a whole house full of Nakashima furniture. Oh. Usually his collectors became dear friends, and because they would come so often, they would talk philosophy as well as furniture. And so my mother would have dinner parties, and some of the collectors would exchange dinner parties with them. And in the 50s, there were several physicians, doctors. One was in New Brunswick and the other was in Princeton.
My husband was the physician for George and Marion and Kevin and Mira.
And when did you meet? How did you first meet?
Well, I met him through my brother. My brother said he's open to the public on Saturday from 12 to 4:30. Why don't you go down and visit him? And my husband happened to be on call the next weekend, so I went with my sister-in-law, and I saw this little bench for $20, and I liked it, and I just bought it. And when I showed it to my husband, he loved it, because he had been in Japan for 2 years, and he had a love for Japanese things. So I said, well, would you like to get down and meet George Nakashima? And he did, and they became friends, and he looked at it, and the furniture said, design my dining room, my living room. Then next we did the bedroom, and then we bought little pieces in between.
Well, of course she collects Nakashima furniture. There's a house full of it, but on the other hand, I think that I want to go out and buy one piece this weekend, and I'm going to buy it. It wasn't assembled that way. It was something that this was a vision for the house that together they created, Phyllis and her husband and George. But no, I don't think this is a collection. I think this is a lifestyle.
Nakashima was a man of the 20th century, and he pushed design forward as much as the century itself did. His language was an expression of his craft and the respect he had for the natural properties of the wood. Rather than discarding the edges, the cracks, the knots, and even signs of termites, traits that have traditionally been considered imperfect, Nakashima preserved, highlighted, and glorified them, turning these features into the focal point of each piece. In his own way, he broke all rules of traditional cabinetry, extended boundaries, and revolutionized the way we think of handcrafted furniture.
he absorbed what he had seen in the northwest coast of the United States growing up as a boy, and then what he saw in Japan, but in Japan through the eyes of Europeans working in Japan. It was a very complex picture. I mean, what he pulled from was not a very easily read or understood menu.
Well, I think the key component to Nakashima was the way he successfully marketed himself to his original buying public for so many years. He had a sort of standardized series of forms, and this is what I find to be quite modern. But then, of course, he had the inventory of slabs of the trees that he had collected over many years. And so the genius was finding works in different economic levels for different types of clients, standardizing the entire process, but still giving each and every purchaser a unique work.
I'm very comfortable combining works from different centuries and from different cultures. Nakashima and American furniture blend so beautifully. We've used Nakashima furniture to what I think is a beautiful end in a dining room in a house on an island that's all about material. The room is paneled in boards that were cut from a tree, felled in the 18th century for shipbuilding, that were lost in Boston Harbor, dredged out of the harbor, and then milled into paneling.
His early pieces were based on fundamental simplicity and were severe, following Japanese principles, with some references to early American furniture.
A portion of his career was the career that, to me, occurred after he left the camp and came out into the open and moved east to New Hope. Financially, they were somewhat strapped. They had to assemble property, materials, work. He had to promote himself. He had to sell the material. So the early work is not as adventuresome. He's not taking big chances. It's really not until the 50s when clients began to seek him out from Philadelphia and other affluent communities, and as he became better known, that frankly his funds were better, and he could buy better wood. He could buy richer flitches of wood. He could experiment more.
Starting in 1943 approximately, and actually 1941, and up till about 1952, George Nakashima's work was quite different than what happened after 1952. He was not using free edges that often. He was, generally speaking, designing pieces of furniture, each one as a custom design for a client, because he didn't have a catalog at that point. He was finding his vocabulary. The Nakashima work from the 40s basically has a very limited audience at this point in time. And I think personally that that's a mistake, because I don't think people really understand it. The market for George's work is, generally speaking, for the wilder the piece, the more free edge the piece, the more interest people have. However, the work from the 40s is very restrained. So there are fewer people who are, and I don't want to say it in a negative sense, but sophisticated enough to really understand the design process that was going on.
What's the market for the earlier work? If it's a germinal piece, if it's the first Kornbluth cabinet, it's the first one of these, if it's a special form he only made early on, there's going to be a really good market for that, but mostly from academics and super advanced collectors. The average buyer is not looking for those.
Nakashima had followers and admirers from the time he opened his studio in 1945. Nelson Rockefeller flew in his helicopter to New Hope and commissioned Nakashima with what has become his most celebrated commission, Rockefeller's Japanese house overlooking the Hudson River. The chairman of the board of the International Paper Company commissioned extraordinary pieces for his office, and for the Met, he furnished her reading room.
My father was in Tokyo in 1934. He worked in the office of Antonin Raymond, who was one of the major innovative architects in Japan in the 20th century. And Junzo Yoshimura was one of his office people, and he was my dad's best friend. And Junzo had designed the motel on the mountain, and I think Nelson saw that and decided he wanted a house kind of like that. So he contacted Junzo, and Junzo did the architecture. And then when it came to furniture, Junzo said, well, I would like my best friend, George, to do your furniture. I think that's how that happened.
And do you remember your father working on this commission?
Yeah, we worked.
Tell me, this was big.
Yes, it was big. And I didn't realize how big it was. I was only working on the shop drawings at that point, and Dad was doing the conceptual drawings. I do remember that it was in the early 70s, just at the first oil crisis, or I think it was one of the first oil crises in the US, and they sent a helicopter to pick up my father to take him to the building to look at. It was a major project. It went on for quite a few years, and in the process, I think my dad was acquiring some exotic lumber, and he used a lot of his most exotic lumber in that house.
Perhaps his most famous commission was the Rockefeller Commission that was done up in Pocantico for Nelson Rockefeller and his wife Happy. And we knew that it was something special. It had been illustrated in numerous magazines. So we received permission to go up and to look at the pieces. Everything was imperial that they had. The scale, because it had to suit the house, was enormous. And there weren't many pieces we could take. But the one piece that was most stellar was the enormous bench with the wonderful spindles that just flowed like islands in the stream.
One of the things that continues to bother me is how sparsely represented Nakashima continues to be in the American museum landscape. He is well covered by museums that focus just on craft. And there are also museums such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art and its reading room, the James Michener Museum, who acquired, in a sense, period interiors of Nakashima that you can sit in and use. But there are still many museums, including the Museum of Modern Art, that have marginalized him into a certain bucket, craft.
One of the most important commissions that George Nakashima ever had was for the International Paper Company headquarters in Manhattan. He was asked to do things that were completely different from almost anything else he'd ever done, if nothing else in terms of scale.
Unlike the name reading room, I find that anytime I've been there, I'm engaged in conversation with other people. So it's really, it's a wonderful place. It's kind of perfect.
But along with these celebrated commissions, his furniture entered the household of hundreds of fans, particularly in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. He knew them all, and he often marked their names in black marker under the pieces.
My mother was the bookkeeper and the office manager most of her life. And she kept all the order records on 3x5 cards. So if people know the name of the original purchaser between 1954 and 85, they're pretty easy to find. They're all filed alphabetically.
In terms of evaluating what something's worth, there are a multitude of areas you have to look in. But basically, the two biggest ones are you have to look at what prices things are going for at auction, and you have to look at what things are going for from dealers.
The first and most important thing, of course, is provenance. And what is glorious about the history of Nakashima is that the vast majority of original collectors of Nakashima have kept their documents. You are still working with either the original owner or perhaps the first generation descendant of that original owner. With an artist as prolific as he was, there are varying levels of importance as well as quality. The general rule of thumb is the more fissures, the more organic, the more richly grained, the more just sculptural and tree-like the form, the more valuable it is.
George Nakashima was born in Seattle in 1905. At the University of Washington, he began studying forestry before switching to architecture and completed Masters in Architecture at MIT. The Great Depression brought an end to most construction in America and halted opportunities for young architects. In 1933, he decided to travel the world, and after spending a year in Paris, he settled in Tokyo and started working for American architect Antonin Raymond.
He was used to a certain meticulous life in the northwest area of the United States. He found the sewage in the streets, the lack of cleanliness of a lot of the people at that point in Japan not to appeal to him. So I think what he saw and what he took away was his work as a professional, as an architect, as an interior designer of furniture.
Nakashima's sophisticated and rich vocabulary was rooted in so many sources, but one of them is the Zen. And do you feel that that aspect of his thoughts, of his furniture, do you feel that that aspect comes into the interior space when you use Nakashima furniture?
It's that connection of the man and his work that brings a metaphysical element into an interior, that bringing in a piece of Nakashima is akin to opening a window. It's giving a room a view onto the world. It's bringing real nature into an interior.
The Second World War was in its full swing when Nakashima moved back to Seattle, and when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, he was placed in a war relocation camp in Idaho with his new wife Marion and newborn baby Mira. It was at that camp that he met a carpenter trained in Japan, and he taught him the skills and tools of Japanese woodworking. George Nakashima entered the camp an architect and left a woodworker. Do you feel that architecture is present in his furniture?
Oh, I do indeed. Absolutely. I think that the structure of the furniture is brought together in a way that is simple, it's authentic, so precisely thought that it is a truth, that it has an honesty that I think we see most often in architecture.
In 1943, Nakashima settled in New Hope, where he built his family's home and where he crafted thousands of pieces of furniture during 5 decades of magnificent career, becoming one of the seminal figures of the American studio movement. Constantly searching for logs, each one was unique. Each had its own history. It was to here that he personally brought his clients to select the wood for their furniture. Each log had its own character, and the role of the woodworker, he used to say, was to identify and preserve its spirit. The shape, color, and grain determined whether a piece of wood would emerge into a dining table, a cabinet, a headboard, turning the wood timeless. George Nakashima created so many types of chairs, but there are really 3 basic chairs. What are they and how do you determine their values?
The simplest chair, the grass-seated chair, is, I think, many curators feel his most iconic and successful chair, because that combination of the fiber as well as the wood sort of symbolizes the American studio movement, but it's also the most modernist of his chairs as well in terms of its function. However, on the collecting market, it is the least expensive chair. The middle chair in terms of its value, as well as probably in terms of its overall popularity, is the new chair. The most expensive chair, the chair that at times has fetched astronomical prices for sets of 8 or 12, especially when it's occasionally come up in actual rosewood, is the conoid chair. And the conoid chair is the most elegant chair, in my opinion. It's that combination of one type of wood, usually walnut, but sometimes other forms, for the seat and the top rail, juxtaposed with the hickory spindles. The rockers, it seems like it's taking the entire sort of Americana tradition. It seems a little old-fashioned to today's audience, and they don't do well when they come up on the market.
Also has this very little 3-legged chair.
Ah,
the mirror chair.
Yes. quite frankly, they're a lot rarer than I think people give credit to. The grass-seated chair, the regular chair, comes up far more frequently than some of these smaller Mira chairs.
The best coffee table for Nakashima, I think, is widely considered to be the pieces that employ a table somewhat like this, where the top is a burl. This is an English oak burl. The other part of this table that makes it extremely impressive is the use of the base, because in the early years, many of the bases were simply 4 legs or 3 legs, turned legs. But in 1958, when he started to develop the conoid line, he began to bring in architectural bases. The juxtaposition of these wildly freeform, beautiful tops and these very structured architectural bases makes him totally unique in the history of design.
Evaluating George Nakashima's coffee tables is a really difficult process, because the difference between one that is almost great and great may be a really slight visual thing, which I'll describe in a moment, but the price could be 5 or 10 times the price. When you get to the top of that pyramid, as it really gets to that point, the differences in quality create exponential differences in value. So the things that I look for, first of all, the wood surface itself, ideally free edge, at least 2 or 3 sides, if not a piece of free edge with a burl, so that spiky burl running around it, split but held together with butterfly joints, ideally of a second wood like rosewood, with some size to it, because as you know, they can be 2 feet, they can be 10 feet, but something that's not too big and not too small. Maybe a 7-foot coffee table that would fit in most houses, because size is a function. The base configuration. Is it a Mingurin base? Is it a conoid base? How exactly is the coffee table held up? Because that's part of the architecture. And for me, of the many things that I love about Nakashima's work, his ability to balance the tabletop and the base is really remarkable.
The free edge furniture is way more valuable, way more expensive than the cut edge or the straight edge furniture.
The beauty is in the eye of the beholder. As far as design goes, the straight edge furniture is probably more difficult to design. And in the beginning, when he first started out in Seattle in 1941, all of his furniture was straight edged, because that's the only lumber he had straight edges. And when we were put in the camps during the war, he was given the task of trying to furnish the barracks so they were a little more livable. And the only materials he had were found materials. There was leftover packing material, there was leftover construction material. There were these twisted little pieces of wood that grew in the desert that were called bitterbrush, and that's what he had to make furniture with. And so he started working a little bit with freeform and absorbing some of the philosophy of Japanese design on the way. And when he came to New Hope and started his furniture business, he didn't have any money. He didn't even have, money enough to buy all the tools he needed. And he would go to the lumber yard and buy the discards. I mean, if you ever go to a sawmill, they cut off the outsides of the logs because they're crooked and they have knots and holes and cracks, and they get to the inside part of the log and then they can make nice straight edge lumber.
In 1945, Nakashima began his first collaboration with the world of industry when designing a line of furniture for Knoll, at the time one of the world's leading manufacturers of modern furniture. While his studio furniture stood apart from industrial objects produced by Knoll, he described his venture as an attempt to fill a lag between mass production and hand craftsmanship. Nakashima designed his second line of mass-produced furniture, and this time for the Widdecombe Furniture Company of Grand Rapids, Michigan. At the very beginning, Widdecombe produced the furniture exactly like he said. Later on, they changed the configurations.
He felt he had made an agreement with Widdecombe. And when anyone makes an agreement, you expect them to hold to it. And I think he was deeply disappointed.
The Widdecombe pieces gave George the opportunity to design free without a client commission, without having to adhere to the limitations of a particular board. I find the Widdecombe furniture to be, while it doesn't reflect his handwork, it does absolutely express his mind, his thought process. Well, what's nice about the Widdecombe is, well, still not inexpensive any longer. It is much more accessible to a much broader audience.
I don't really deal very much with the Widdecombe or Knoll pieces. I handle them occasionally, but the Widdecombe and the Knoll pieces are both manufactured essentially, and they were meant for mass marketing. What we're looking at with Knoll and Widdecombe is standardization. And I'm not that interested in George's designs that could be manufactured, in addition to which both Knoll and Widdecombe had significant input in how those designs developed. So they aren't always pure George Nakashima.
On one hand, it shows some of the vision and expressiveness of Nakashima's work. On the other hand, it's factory furniture. It's almost at odds with the spirit of the wood and the New Hope vibe that I was brought up in. It's in some ways anathema to that. So I appreciate and respect the fact that it's able to achieve such a high level of quality being factory furniture. I just don't have the same visceral or emotional response to it.
Everything changed in 1989 when the Museum of American Crafts opened the retrospective George Nakashima Full Circle. He was 84 years old and finally was placed at the center of American modernism. No longer was he considered a craftsman, but a seminal designer in the narrative of modern design. The curator, Derek Ostergard, chose to silhouette Nakashima's work against his contemporaries, post-war stars such as Charles Eames, Gilbert Rhodey, and Charlotte Perriand.
Paul Smith was the director at that time, and to me, one of the great directors whose own intellectual pursuits and passions were completely aligned with the institution he headed. And he called me, I went over to his apartment, he asked if I'd be interested in curating the show. He basically gave me carte blanche. He said, do what you want, see him as you choose, we'll get his voice in the exhibition and in the catalog. It was really based on aesthetics, and George went along completely. Everything I asked him to do, George really didn't interfere, which to me is testimony to his confidence.
All the furniture came from that show, came back to the studio the week before he died. So, and the show is prophetically called The Full Circle. So I think he felt that he had completed his circle and that his work had become known as art.
Derek Ostergard came to visit you.
Yes.
He went all over the house and he was looking at everything and he ended up choosing this table. And this table, not only that he chose it, but he also featured it on the cover of the catalog. Did you know at that time that this little table is special?
I loved it, but I had no idea it was that special. He wrote his autobiography called The Soul of a Tree. It was like a human being almost. It was something so personal to him, the wood. And everything in the wood, the cracks, everything.
For the retrospective, he prepared one of the most outstanding examples of his free-edge work. He's named the ambitious table crafted of an enormous redwood burl from Northern California, Arlen, after his major collector and personal physician, Dr. Arthur Krosnick of Princeton, who patronized the piece. It was presented at the exhibition as Nakashima's latest work, the most powerful piece he has ever done. 3 days before the opening of the exhibition, Krosnick's home burned down to all of the 200-something pieces that he had acquired from Nakashima for decades. The only piece to survive the fire were those lent to the exhibition.
I was at home and Evelyn called. And she was very calm, but truly upset. I mean, of course she'd be upset. She lost everything. I mean, and it was not practiced. It wasn't done for the cameras. It was just Evelyn, who was a very strong person, saying it's going to be better than it was before.
Well, I remember my mother and my brother and I were shopping or something in Princeton, and we saw this huge plume of black smoke. But I didn't know what it was until we came home, and I think somebody had told us that their house had burned down. We didn't know how bad it was until the Krosnicks themselves came to visit my father. Mrs. Krosnick was in tears. Then my father said, "That's all right, Evelyn, it's okay, we'll rebuild everything." That was in May when her house burnt down. And my father had a stroke in October of that year. My mother blamed the Krosnicks for giving him that much extra work later in his life.
Together with Mira, George Nakashima started rebuilding that collection in a project that had come to be his last major commission. After her father died, Mira took over as a design director of the studio and completed the Krosnick collection. It was ultimately sold by Sotheby's in 2006 under the leadership of James Zemaitis.
It was 2006. Dr. and Mrs. Krosnick were on the verge of selling their house in Princeton and moving to a retirement community in Scottsdale. And quite famously, they had collected Nakashima's furniture for years and years and years over time, like many collectors do. And then in 1989, their house burned to the ground in the last year of George's life. And then 1 year afterwards, finished with the close collaboration of Mira, the Krosnicks rebuilt their entire collection. And it afforded this family, the Nakashimas and the Krosnicks, to revisit their history together, not only rebuild, but create an entire new aesthetic that represents Nakashima not only in his final years, but at his most Baroque, at his most organic, at his most spiritual. And the pieces are magnificent. The wood is just the best wood you could possibly find.
Nakashima was a woodworker and an American legend, but he was also an extraordinary man whose vision is living with us to this day. His language was born from the notion that the wood should speak for itself, not to cover, not to cut away, not to adorn, but to respect nature enough to give it the starring role.